What would you do if, after a lifetime of silence, the moment finally came to prove your worth, and everyone laughed at you? The laughter was sharp, cruel. It echoed through the marble lobby of First National Bank as the 90-year-old black woman spoke. I just want to check my balance. Her voice was calm, but the room reacted instantly. Heads turned. Whispers spread. Smiles curled with judgment. At the center of it all stood Charles Hayes, the bank president. 52 years old. Perfect suit. Perfect posture. A man who had never been questioned in this building. He laughed. Not out of kindness. Out of certainty. Ma'am, he said loudly, making sure everyone heard, I think you're confused. This is a private bank. Perhaps the community branch down the street would suit you better. The message was clear. You do not belong here. The woman leaned on her wooden cane. Her coat was plain. Her shoes worn. But her eyes did not ask for permission. Young man, she said evenly, I did not ask for directions. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a black card. I said I want to check my balance. The laughter around them faded, replaced by uncomfortable murmurs. Charles glanced at the card and scoffed. Old. Bent. Fake, he decided. Janet, he snapped to his assistant, another fake card. Security, if you please. A few wealthy clients chuckled. Someone whispered. Poor thing. Margaret did not move. She did not plead. She did not explain. She smiled. A slow, knowing smile. The kind that carries decades of patience. For just a second, Charles felt something strange tighten in his chest. A warning. He ignored it. Two guards stepped closer. Ma'am, one said gently, we need to escort you outside. Margaret's smile faded. Her posture changed. Straight spine. Lifted chin. She had lived through segregation. She knew what escort outside really meant. Young man, she said calmly, I am not leaving. I am a client of this bank. And before this day ends, everyone in this room will understand exactly who I am. Before we continue, if you have not done it yet, subscribe to this channel for stories that will shake your beliefs and stay with you long after they end. And now, let us continue. Before we continue, if this story is already making you feel something, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Now, let's continue. Charles laughed again, louder, like he wanted the sound to drown her out. See, everyone, he announced to the lobby, this is exactly why we have security. Confused people trying to use services they do not understand. A rich woman nearby, Catherine Vance, lifted her designer bag to half cover her grin. Poor thing, she whispered, loud enough to land like a slap. Maybe Alzheimer's. My maid was like that. And then the whole room got hit with something nobody expected. Margaret laughed. Not weak. Not bitter. A deep laugh, rich and steady, like music filling the lobby and forcing people to listen. Alzheimer's, she said, calm as ever. That is funny, because I remember very clearly the day I worked 14 hours cleaning your grandfather's office, back in 1955. The lobby went silent. Not awkward silence. Real silence. Charles froze. His family had owned the bank since 1932. Almost nobody knew anything personal about his grandfather, not stories like that. Excuse me, Charles said, and suddenly his voice did not sound so sure. You were 15, Margaret continued, and her tone stayed soft, almost casual, like she was reading facts from a notebook. I worked after school so my mother and I could eat. Your grandfather used to leave cigarettes burning on the marble, just to see if I would dare complain. She looked straight at Charles. I never complained. We needed the money. Janet swallowed hard. She had heard rumors about the old Hayes family, but hearing it like this, out loud, in front of clients, was different. Margaret kept going, steady. I remember when your grandfather told me people like me should be thankful to serve people like him. He said it was our natural place in life. She gave a small, sad smile. Funny how habits travel from one generation to the next, isn't it, young Hayes? Charles's face turned red. Sweat gathered at his hairline. These are stories, he muttered. Anyone can lie. Margaret did not blink. Your grandfather had a scar on his left hand, she said slowly. He got it the day he tried to break a glass over my head when I was 17. He missed, cut his own hand, and later told everyone it was a gardening accident. The air got heavier. A few customers quietly walked out. No one wanted to be part of this. Charles felt control slipping through his fingers, and panic crawled into his throat. Then Margaret said something that made the room feel like it shrank. I have spent 70 years wondering if I would ever get the chance to show the Hayes family what someone like me can become, once she refuses to stay invisible. Every attempt Charles made to humiliate her did not break her. It only woke something up. Something strong. Something patient. Something built over years of unfair treatment. People stood around her believing they were better. They whispered. They judged. They laughed. And they had no idea that every insult was writing their own shame. Margaret learned a truth long ago. Patience is not weakness. Sometimes, patience is strategy. Charles tried to stand tall, like the boss, like the king of the room. But inside, he was shaking. Margaret had details. Real details. The kind you do not guess. Doubt started eating at him, slow and sharp. But pride still ruled him. He would not let a 90-year-old black woman embarrass him in front of wealthy clients. Security, he shouted, and his voice cracked just a little. Remove this woman immediately, and if she refuses, call the police. Gasps spread. Some people stepped back like they were watching a show. Margaret did not move. Her posture changed. Shoulders back. Spine straight. Chin lifted. In one breath, she stopped looking like a fragile grandmother and started looking like a survivor of segregation, racism, humiliation, and injustice. Her eyes locked on Charles. Sharp. Fearless. Charles took a small step back without meaning to. Young Hayes, she said, and her voice cut through the room, are you sure you want to call the police on a client of your own bank? I believe the newspapers would enjoy that story. The word newspapers hit Charles harder than a slap. For a split second, his mind raced. Headlines. Phones ringing. Board members calling. Investors panicking. All because of a scene in the lobby, started by a woman he had dismissed in less than 10 seconds. You are not a client, he snapped, trying to regain control. You do not even have an account here. Margaret tilted her head slightly, like she was amused by how predictable he had become. Oh, but I do, she replied. I have had one for a very long time. She turned to Janet. Young lady, would you mind checking account number 704916? The numbers came out slow, clear, and confident. Janet's fingers froze over the keyboard. She looked at Charles, uncertain. Sir, she whispered, maybe we should just verify. Charles clenched his jaw. Do it, he said sharply. But I guarantee this is a waste of time. Janet typed. The system loaded. And then her eyes widened. Her posture changed instantly. She leaned closer to the screen, blinking like her eyes were playing tricks on her. Sir, she said again, louder this time. You should come see this. Charles walked over, annoyed, ready to prove everyone wrong. But the moment he looked at the screen, the color drained from his face. Balances filled the monitor. Rows of numbers. Long numbers. The kind of numbers he only saw in board meetings and private vaults. This cannot be right, he whispered. Janet swallowed. Account holder, Margaret Williams. Assets under management, several trusts, investment portfolios, and private holdings. Total balance, over $300 million. The lobby felt like it stopped breathing. A woman dropped her phone. Someone else audibly gasped. The security guard slowly stepped back. Charles stared at the screen, then at Margaret, then back at the screen. 300 million, he repeated, his voice hollow. Margaret nodded gently. I started with nothing, she said. I cleaned houses. I saved every dollar. I invested quietly. I learned patience. While people laughed, I built. While people underestimated me, I listened. She took a small step forward. I did not come here to be admired. I came to check my balance. Silence swallowed the room. Charles felt his authority crumble. Everything he had used to measure worth, power, importance, all of it collapsed in front of him. Catherine Vance avoided eye contact. Other wealthy clients suddenly found the floor very interesting. Margaret turned slowly, taking in every face. Some of you laughed, she said calmly. Some of you stayed quiet. And some of you enjoyed watching me be humiliated. She paused. But none of you asked a single question. Not one. Charles forced a smile, desperate now. Mrs. Williams, he said, please accept my apologies. There must have been a misunderstanding. Margaret raised a hand. No, young man. There was no misunderstanding. There was judgment. And you were very clear about it. She turned back to Janet. How long has this account been here, dear? Janet checked again, her hand still shaking. Since 1978. Margaret nodded. I was 28. And I promised myself something that day. I promised I would never let anyone decide my worth by my appearance again. Charles felt something worse than fear. Shame. Real shame. And it burned. The board of directors arrived less than 20 minutes later. 6 men. 2 women. All in a hurry. All confused. All trying to understand why the president of the bank was standing pale and silent beside a 90-year-old woman with a cane. Margaret did not sit. She stood tall while they gathered around. Mrs. Williams, one director said carefully, we have been informed of a serious situation. Margaret nodded. Yes. So have I. She looked directly at Charles. I was laughed at. Insulted. And threatened with removal from a bank where I have kept my money for nearly 5 decades. One director turned to Charles. Is this true? Charles opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Janet stepped forward. Yes, sir, she said. It is. Every word. The room shifted. Power moved. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. Margaret spoke again. I do not want apologies. I do not want speeches. I want accountability. She tapped her cane once on the marble. I have lived long enough to see too many powerful men walk away from their behavior without consequence. That ends today. One director cleared his throat. What would you like us to do, Mrs. Williams? Margaret did not hesitate. I want Charles Hayes removed from his position, effective immediately. Gasps. Charles's head snapped up. You cannot do that, he said, panic rising. She is just one client. Margaret smiled, calm and deadly. I am not just one client. I am one of your largest private account holders. And I am not alone. She turned slightly. There are others like me. Quiet. Invisible. Watching. If I leave this bank today, so will they. Silence returned, heavier than before. The directors exchanged looks. They knew the math. They knew the damage. They knew the headlines. One by one, they nodded. Charles's shoulders dropped. Security approached him this time. Sir, one guard said softly, we need you to come with us. The same words. Different meaning. Charles looked at Margaret. Please, he said, his voice breaking. I was raised differently. I did not mean. Margaret raised her hand again. You meant exactly what you showed. She leaned closer. And today, the world showed you something in return. As Charles was escorted away, Margaret turned back to the board. I will keep my accounts here, she said. For now. But understand this. Respect is not optional. It is the minimum. The board nodded. Yes, Mrs. Williams. When the lobby finally emptied, Janet approached Margaret. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret smiled warmly now. No, dear. Thank you for listening. She walked toward the exit, slow but steady. A woman who had once been invisible. And who would never be unseen again. The story did not end in that marble lobby. In many ways, it began there. By the afternoon, rumors were already spreading. By evening, they became facts. By the next morning, they were headlines. Bank president removed after discrimination incident. Elderly black woman exposes decades of silent wealth. Power, racism, and accountability inside a private bank. Charles Hayes did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his empty apartment, suit jacket still on, staring at his phone as messages piled up. Board members. Lawyers. Friends who suddenly sounded distant. People who once laughed at his jokes now spoke carefully, like they were choosing every word through glass. He replayed the scene again and again. The cane. The card. The numbers on the screen. The moment he realized he was wrong. Not mistaken. Wrong. For the first time in his life, his privilege had failed him publicly. Meanwhile, Margaret returned home to a small, quiet house. Nothing extravagant. No guards. No gates. Just memories. Photos lined the walls. Her mother in a faded black and white picture. Her younger self standing in a borrowed dress on graduation day. A newspaper clipping from years ago, folded carefully. Local woman funds scholarships for underprivileged youth. Margaret made tea and sat by the window. She did not celebrate. She did not feel angry. She felt complete. She had not walked into the bank seeking revenge. She had walked in carrying truth. And truth, when spoken out loud, has weight. Later that evening, her phone rang. Mrs. Williams, a voice said respectfully, "This is the chairman of the board. We want to formally apologize." Margaret listened quietly. "We are implementing mandatory bias training. We are reviewing our internal culture. And we would be honored if you would consider joining our advisory council." Margaret smiled softly. "I will consider it," she said. "But understand something. Training does not change hearts. Accountability does." The call ended. Margaret looked down at her hands. Hands that had scrubbed floors. Hands that had written checks. Hands that had signed contracts no one ever expected her to understand. She whispered to herself, "I survived long enough to see the world blink. And finally, see me." Weeks passed. The bank changed. New leadership. New policies. New faces at the front desk. But the story followed. On television. Online. In conversations between strangers. People debated. Some said Margaret had gone too far. Others said she did not go far enough. Margaret ignored the noise. She focused on her foundations. Education. Housing. Legal aid for those who had been quietly pushed aside for decades. One afternoon, a young black girl knocked on her door. She looked nervous. "My teacher told me about you," the girl said. "She said you were very brave." Margaret knelt slowly to meet her eyes. "Bravery is not loud," she said. "It is choosing not to shrink when the world tells you to." The girl smiled. "I want to be like you." Margaret shook her head gently. "No. Be bigger. Years later, business schools would teach the incident as a case study. Not about money. About arrogance. About blind spots. About how power collapses the moment it forgets humanity. Charles Hayes eventually found another job. Lower. Quieter. Without applause. The world did not end for him. But it changed. And sometimes, change is punishment enough. Margaret lived to 98. She attended scholarship ceremonies. She sat in front rows. She listened more than she spoke. When she passed, her will surprised no one who truly knew her. Large donations. Clear instructions. One final note, handwritten. Never confuse silence with weakness. And in the quiet of a system that once laughed at her, her legacy continued to speak. Margaret's funeral was simple. Just as she wanted. No luxury cars. No long speeches filled with empty praise. Just people. People whose lives had changed quietly because of her. Former students. Single mothers. Young professionals who had once been told they were not good enough. They stood together in the small chapel, listening, remembering. One man spoke. "I would not be here without her scholarship." A woman followed. "She paid my legal fees when I was about to lose my home." Another voice trembled. "She never asked for recognition. She only asked one question. What do you need?" Margaret's portrait stood near the front. Not young. Not glamorous. Just her. Calm eyes. Gentle smile. Unbreakable presence. Outside the chapel, reporters waited. But no family member spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Her life had already said everything. Back at the bank, a plaque was installed near the entrance. Small. Simple. It read, "In honor of Margaret Williams. Client. Philanthropist. Reminder." Employees passed it every morning. Some read it. Some ignored it. But everyone felt it. Because once a system is exposed, it never forgets. And once someone like Margaret walks through your doors, you are never the same again. Years later, a new intern stood at the same front desk. Nervous. Young. Wearing shoes that were too cheap for the marble floor beneath her. She looked up at the plaque and asked quietly, "Who was Margaret Williams?" The receptionist smiled. She was a woman who reminded powerful people that respect is not earned by money. It is revealed by behavior. The intern nodded slowly. Then she straightened her posture. Because stories like that do something. They travel. They settle. They wake people up. Margaret Williams never raised her voice. She never demanded attention. She simply refused to be dismissed. And in doing so, she changed a room. Then a bank. Then thousands of lives that would never know her name, but would live differently because of her choices. That is how real power moves. Not loudly, but permanently.